Happy Thursday, everybody. We'll get started in just a second. Just a quick technical note for my host colleagues. Were we able to get the waiting room turned off, or do I need to keep an eye on that?
Yeah, I just asked Liam that in the chat.
Okay,
Liam, are you able to, or is it not allowing us today?
I'm trying it now.
cool. You can see a little
It
behind the
worked.
scenes.
No,
Sorry,
it's not.
classic.
All right, I'll keep an eye on it, Dana.
Thank
Same.
you. I have it up too. So you got to see a little bit of the wizard behind the curtain. We are currently having a blood feud with Zoom over the waiting room setting on the calls. Keeps things exciting. Welcome to the nature-based hazard mitigation installment of our summer 2025 disaster resiliency series, co-hosted and co-planned by the Central Appalachian Network and Reimagine Appalachia. I'm really happy for folks who've been able to join us this morning. I'm going to be your flight attendant for the day. I'll get you started with a little bit of details about the webinar and what to expect. As we're getting started, please feel free to share your name and your organization, where you work, and maybe a little bit about why you're interested in this topic today. I know a lot of people come to these events to network and meet other people who are working on the same issue. So we really encourage you all to do that networking in the chat, get to know each other a little bit as we're going through the topics. We have a lot of incredible speakers today, which I am both really excited. I'm incredibly excited to hear from the speakers we have today and the variety of projects we're going to be able to showcase with you all. It does make for a packed agenda, but it's also a real honor to be able to hear from all these experts coming to us from different parts of the region. Great to see those introductions coming up in the chat. Y'all can continue to do those. So as we've all noticed, Appalachia and other areas of the country are getting more rain, more intense storms, more extreme temperatures, and our communities need to be more prepared. The goal of these webinars is to cut through a lot of the noise we're seeing and create real concrete opportunities for our communities to share what's working for us and ideas to move towards implementation and resilience building to help our areas to be more resilient to the floods and other natural disasters we're seeing. As we're getting started, I'm going to show a couple slides and open with a couple polls. The first poll is sort of a tester. Let me know if you need that link. I did drop it at the top. I'll grab it for y'all. So this is a Menti poll. If you haven't done them before, welcome to a Reimagine webinar. They are our favorite. You can click that link in the chat and then your answer will appear on the screen as I'm sharing it. Great. I see 4 people have already found it, or maybe 1 person. You can click, I believe you can click as many options as apply to you and your community. Just a little note as we're getting started, you can turn on closed captions for this webinar if that helps you process the content better. We always encourage that. You can find that option in the more 3 little dots at the bottom, or the word more, and then the word captions should pop up. And I believe you can choose the language that those appear for you if you prefer a language other than English. We also will send out the slide decks and the recording of this webinar to everyone who registered. And so if you're here right now, that means you registered and you gave us your email address. And so you would be getting that follow-up email as long as you gave us the right email address, which I can't help you with. That does happen. Like I noted, this is part of a series of events. Our next webinar is going to be August 19th. Talking about some of the federal disaster relief landscape and what that looks like. We'll have different experts coming together to unpack all of those acronyms with us. The September 16th webinar is going to be talking about what happens after a disaster and some of the mutual aid groups and other groups that have come together and sort of what they've learned after a disaster when it comes to those immediate days following the disaster. And October 14th, the webinar is going to be talking about telling the story. How do we communicate about these? Where are the communication barriers? I think that one will be much more of a back and forth with folks. What are you struggling with? What do you what does your community need to know, and what do you have a hard time articulating that you wish folks understood better about flooding? Yeah, for folks just joining us, we're currently working our way through a poll. Other upcoming events, we do have a manufacturing series as well throughout the summer. So if you guys are interested in the wind supply chain or talking about manufacturing and how to grow that in the region broadly, it's a bit off topic than flooding, but I wanted to drop those in the links for you too. Reimagine does a little bit of a lot. And then just while we're on the topic of disasters, I know it's never far from our minds. So I just want to acknowledge all of the grief and stress about all these increased disasters, most recently in the region, in the Wheeling area. I have some links from some of our partners in the Wheeling area if folks are interested in donating into the recovery there. We have information from the folks in Wheeling about who's digging in right now and where folks are needing some extra support. Obviously, we've seen flooding on the East Coast in the last week, and of course, the absolutely tragic flooding in Texas. And so I do want to name those dynamics. I am going to move us to the next slide. I can see all of you all know exactly what I'm talking about when it comes to just the way that disasters are present in our day-to-day lives. Apologies in advance if your state is not on my chart. It doesn't fit that many. Please share in the chat if we have left you out. I'm going to guess Tennessee. Sorry, Tennessee. But please do share in the chat if you have a state that you want to fill out and you don't see an option there. New York, welcome from New York. Welcome from Tennessee. Yeah, food distribution. Yeah, great. Great to see all these numbers rolling in. I think it can help our speakers to know a little bit about where y'all are coming from and what topics you're most interested in. That's another reason that we run these polls at the start. So it looks like folks we have about 60 people who filled in the where you work. And so now I'm switching us to what kind of work you do, where you're coming to us from. I apologize again if your sector is not in here, and I know that this is a network of people that wear a lot of hats. You all have many roles. So I believe I made it so you can choose as many roles as you identify with, because there's entirely possible that there's folks on this call who are all 8 of those options in their community. So it is really helpful to get a sense of who uses these webinars and who comes and who needs the information. Just as we're going over this poll and giving you folks a moment to add your information about your role. Oh, I allowed you to write on it. I apologize. That's probably a functionality that I gave permission to. That's a new one. That's fantastic. If you're in other, feel free to drop that in the chat so we can get a sense of who we left out when we made the poll. Just a quick note on the run of show, and for folks who are just joining us, you can turn on closed captions. We're going to have a series of speakers. This webinar is an hour and a half long. The speakers will mostly wrap up within the first hour, and then we'll have the second half hour for in-depth Q&A. So we will have you hold your questions to the end, but you're very welcome to drop questions in the chat as the speakers are going. Oftentimes, we have so many experts on this call, both our speakers as well as folks who attend, who have so much knowledge about the region. So if y'all have any questions while people are speaking, please just drop those in the chat and we'll either flag them for the Q&A section in the second hour of the call, or we may be able to address those directly as you have them. And then just one last question for you all, and then I'll set you free to the speakers that you signed up to hear from today. If you are interested in this kind of project, where are you at in your planning? Are you just interested in the big concept of the idea, learning more to see what it might mean for your community, or, do you really have a lot of projects in motion and you're looking to see what other groups are digging into? And I think this would be particularly helpful for our speakers. So many great folks. And like I said at the top, we really do want you all to be interacting and networking in the chat. So please feel free to do that. And in just a minute, I'm going to hand it over to Jessica Arians, the Senior Program Manager for Climate and Energy Policy for the National Wildlife Federation, to give us an overview of the definition of terms and some of the concepts that brought us together here today. So I'm going to turn off my screen. This slide is still, this poll is still active, so you can still take the poll. But hi, Jessica.
Great. Hello, thanks so much, Dana, and hello, everyone. It's so great to be here. I'm going to share my screen really quick and present. Let me know if you can't see this. But yeah, as Dana said, my name is Jessica. I'm with the National Wildlife Federation, and I'm going to just spend a few minutes talking about kind of giving us the grounding in what is nature-based hazard mitigation. I know there's lots of folks in the chat who may be quite familiar, some who are new. So hopefully just give everyone a sense of the terms. For those that don't know, NWF is a national conservation organization, and we work to really help to ensure that people and wildlife can thrive in a rapidly changing world. And NWF has worked for a number of years on nature-based solutions, which is sort of an umbrella term that encompasses hazard mitigation. I'll talk a little bit more about all the different terms for this kind of stuff. We do this through policy advocacy at the federal, state, and local level, through engaging with on-the-ground projects, especially in parts of the eastern US and in the Gulf, and then also through an environmental justice lens. And we recently actually have a center we launched, the Natural Infrastructure Center for Environmental Justice and Resilience, or NICER. And I think my colleague, Holly Kitzner, who's the program manager here, is hopefully in the audience and can maybe provide more information on that if folks want in the chat. But that's who we are, and just a little bit of NWF's work in this space. And then what is nature-based hazard mitigation? So in general, we define this as natural, or nature mimicking systems that help communities reduce the impacts of disasters, including floods. These systems can be entirely natural, so think of like a forest or a floodplain or dunes, or they can incorporate engineered features that use natural materials. So think of like a rain garden maybe, or engineered stream stabilization. They can be a complement to traditional infrastructure or an alternative to it, or they can work together. And I think the key thing here is that they have these many co-benefits. So beyond just disaster risk reduction, they have a lot of co-benefits for people and wildlife, things like water quality. They provide wildlife habitat, recreational opportunities, like sort of they can protect cultural and just, it's nice to be in a park, for example. And then they go by a lot of different related or overlapping names. So you may have heard of natural infrastructure or nature-based solutions, a term I used earlier, or even green infrastructure or natural defenses. I think, if you're working on this in the policy standpoint or a scientific standpoint, or like at big international bodies like the UN, there are sort of differences to the definitions, but I think in general, they're sort of all talking about the same thing. So just wanted to acknowledge there's a lot of different terms for this. You may have heard some. They're all kind of talking about what we're talking about today. This is just another graphic I really like from NOAA that shows kind of the diversity and what these nature-based hazard mitigation solutions can look like. So you can see here some of them that are entirely natural, like a forest or a sand dune or corals, but some of them are kind of a mix. So you think of a green roof or a living shoreline, or a urban forestry, so planting more trees in urban spaces, just showing the breadth of what these kind of solutions can look like. So how are these approaches different from traditional hazard mitigation approaches? Historically, most US communities have relied on structural approaches, sort of sometimes called gray infrastructure, to guard against natural hazards. So think of some of the things you see here: dams and levees, stream channelization, which is the photo on the left that's sort of taking the natural flow of a stream, which in general is super windy and goes all over the place, and making it sort of run in a more rigid and straight lane. So these are the traditional approaches to protecting against hazards, and sometimes they work really well. I don't think we're ever going to get rid of them, but there are some downsides to them, and we're increasingly seeing that due to increasing impacts of climate. In general, infrastructure in the US is pretty old, it's aging, And it's not really built to withstand the extreme weather we're increasingly seeing. And we see that, in flood examples where levees or dikes are breaking or dams are overflowing. I think in the most recent flooding just this past year, maybe this year in Tennessee, there was a levee that flooded and it prompted evacuations of the town. So these approaches aren't, all bad, but more and more, I think there's an interest in natural approaches that can complement or supplant these, and those have a lot of benefits. So some nature-based approaches, just for examples here, green stormwater infrastructure is a big one. The photo on the left is actually from the city of Pittsburgh that has an initiative to transform vacant city lots into green infrastructure. So you can kind of see the cool before and after of what happens when it rains, when you have a vacant lot and a bunch of asphalt and the water that just that flows in a particular way, versus you have this green stormwater infrastructure where water can be absorbed by trees and native plants. The photo on the right is from floodplain restoration in Vermont, another state that, like many places in Appalachia, has experienced lots of flooding in recent years. So floodplain conservation and restoration is another great example of nature-based approaches. Wetland protection is also a great example, even dam removals or levee setbacks. Again, it's not necessarily a one or the other approach when we're talking about this. They can sort of complement each other and work together. And then what are the benefits for flood mitigation and resilience? And I had to get a beaver photo on here as someone that works for a wildlife organization, and because beavers are great at flood resilience and control as little natural ecosystem engineers. But our wonderful panel of speakers, or the folks after me, will talk about this in a lot more specifics, but just in general, these kind of approaches can both reduce flood height and slow floodwater flow. So if you're giving water more space to sort of absorb into the ground or more space to go, it can slowly store and release floodwaters. The wetlands are a great way to do that. And in a more maybe urban setting, having some of this like green stormwater infrastructure, those rain gardens can actually take pressure off sewage treatment plants and even help improve water quality. In general, I will say that nature-based approaches to hazard mitigation really depend on, how efficient they are depends on a lot of things, including like where they are, the severity of the natural hazards they're trying to protect against, the vulnerability of the community, lots of different factors to consider here, but they hold a lot of promise. And then just one more graphic from NWF, just another way to look at benefits across different ecosystem types and kind of the ways they can help protect against natural hazards, including flooding. And that's it from me. I look forward to learning more from our speakers in the conversation. That's my email. Feel free to reach out. And then the website there is just a resource I wanted to flag for folks. This is a funding database just focused on federal funding. So a little dicey at the moment, if I'm being honest with some of these. But if you're looking for resources to fund nature-based hazard mitigation projects, that's a good source to go to. I'm happy to talk more about it in the chat. But I'm going to stop sharing and turn it back to Dana for the next speaker. Thanks.
Yeah, our next speaker is Mark Buchanan to talk from the West Virginia Brownfields Assistance Center at Marshall University. We are really excited to learn about some of the projects you're working on. So I'll hand it over to you, Mark. And you are muted.
Yes,
You're
I'm
on.
muted. I didn't want to be that guy, and I turned out being that guy. So
We've all been that guy. It's good. It makes you all laugh.
at least panic didn't set in. My name is Mark Buchanan, and I work at the Brownfield Assistance Center at Marshall University's Resiliency Center. I have a variety of projects that I work on across the state that focus on brownfield and brownfield redevelopment. But we are also branching out into stormwater management, water quality, watershed issues, which is really exciting because that's where the majority of my background comes from. So I threw together some slides. I am long-winded, and I promise you, I do have a clock here that I'm watching that I'm going to try not to go over. If I start to get close, just let me know. But again, we'll move forward with some projects here. Let's see, go ahead and advance the slide if you could. Are you in control or am I in control? It's not working.
Yeah, you should be able to click towards the right of your screen and see if it'll switch to the next slide.
There it goes. Okay. All right. Apologies.
Looks great.
All right. First off, real quick, I like to give context about these projects and how these work. When it comes down to water quantity or water quality for that matter. A lot of it comes back to the setting that we're working in. And when you're talking about urbanized or urbanizing landscapes, its impervious surface is what we're really dealing with. And we end up in the graphic there at the top. You can see with runoff about 10%, only about, and about 50% of that water gets to infiltrate into the soils, just like what the previous speaker had mentioned. When you start looking at an urbanized setting, when we're looking at around 75 to 100% impervious cover, a lot of roads, roofs, parking lots, all of those types of settings, it really alters the hydrology. And if you look at the graphic, 55% becomes runoff. So that creates a variety of problems that you have to deal with. And when you look at a hydrograph, this is one of my favorite graphics when I do presentations and have these conversations. But what you're looking at is a hydrograph across the x-axis. We have time, and on the y-axis here on this left-hand side, we have the stream flow. And the solid blue line shows a typical stream in the course of a rain event. You have a really gradual rise, a peak, and then a fall for the water level. When we're dealing with a really heavily urbanized type of landscape, you have this really abrupt, fast, movement of the water column. Technically, you have a higher peak, rapid discharge, and it causes a lot of issues. Not only are we dealing with extra volumes of water, a lot of that runoff will carry non-point source pollutants. And in addition, since we're talking about the problems associated with some of these urbanized or urbanizing type landscapes, I know in the state that I'm in, we have MS4 regulations for our municipalities, because a lot of this infrastructure is aged and old, and you have stormwater that actually shares lines with, storm drains. Storm drains and sewage are collected in the same pipe, and then when you have an inch of rain or a half an inch of rain, you end up with what's called a combined sewer overflow, and it discharges out into that receiving body. So you end up with water quality issues in addition to some water quantity. We are, and like I mentioned before, I come from I guess I'm getting up in years and old, because I was looking back at some projects I thought about sharing, and I thought I would go back and share on one of the very first projects when I was fortunate enough to work for our conservation agency several years ago. But we were trying to put some stormwater infrastructure in some of our conservation districts, and in doing so, we were trying to help learn about these projects. And what I'm going to share is some of the good, the bad, and the ugly, because it was a learning process, and believe me, there was a lot of ugly to go around with our experience with this project, and perhaps. But most folks are familiar with the rain garden. You have a depressed area, you excavate the soil, you put an engineered mix in, and in this case, we had an engineering firm help us out with the design and sizing the garden, speccing out the types of soil that we would use. And we ended up with, I think it was 70%, the mixture was 70% sand, 20% Pagnum, can you say it, peat moss, basically, mixed with some native soil. And we didn't realize at the time that we had a really heavy layer of clay in our construction site. And another problem that we ran into, I don't know if you can see, if the picture shows up well, this is the garden here, the site that we were going to use. This is the Child Development Academy at Marshall University. They did not, when they did the design work, they didn't take into account, I think it was around 5,000 square feet of roof for a warehouse beside us. And if you look where they're starting the excavation and we have the kids watching, this is the warehouse. So we were catching half that building into our garden as well, which was not, they didn't, work up a design for such a large impervious surface. Nonetheless, we ended up at the garden, the construction went great. Plants went in. We were really trying to share with the city and show them that, this is what we need to be doing to try to help out, the MS4 regulations. And, we're going to try to capture that first inch of rainfall off of our impervious surface. And what we ended up with was the water continued to stand for days on end, 24 hours, 48, all the way up to, 4 or 5 days. And ultimately we ended up with the local municipality had to send in a couple of trucks, vac trucks, to draw down the water because we created essentially a mosquito nursery right beside a daycare center. So this was a PR nightmare for a lot of us, me involved. But we were able to rectify the situation fairly quickly, relatively speaking. And we ended up putting in an overflow. And the overflow was attached to a valve, and that valve sent a line over to the stormwater, the existing stormwater infrastructure. So what would happen is in a situation, the rain would fall, water would pool just like it was supposed to. We would get a certain amount of uptake from the local plants that we put in. Well, if the water stood for more than, I think it was 3 days, it was up to the maintenance folks there on the university that they would have to go in and open the valve. And that white pipe with a cap on top there, that's the valve that they would actually turn. It would open it up and it would literally drain like a bathtub. Over the course of about 8 or 10 hours, it would completely drain. There's some that would argue that kind of short-circuited our effort ultimately, but it still allowed us to have that conversation. And from that point forward, we didn't put another rain garden in unless we could see that it had an under drain at least attached to it, either an active one, like where somebody would turn a valve, or some sort of passive type system, just because of some of the liabilities of where we were constructing these things inside sometimes urban settings. I'm going to move through some of these. This is called Connor Street. It was over in Putnam County in Hurricane. We did run into some issues, and a lot of it came back to deal with. And I don't know how many of you folks actually have got to put rain gardens in, but when you basically hand over the keys on whether this thing is going to be a success or not, you literally give away all type of control in that you hand it over to folks who do the maintenance who might not understand the process. So it's a good idea to at least have some sort of sit down conversation about how you should end up, keeping the garden clean of debris, and as well as the managing of the vegetation. The Putnam County Board of Education had a group of guys who loved their weed eaters, and they literally obliterated probably $2,000 worth of plants that following summer. So yeah, that was just one thing I thought I would at least share because it was pretty interesting. Larger projects that I got involved with, a lot of times you have to give up the aesthetics just for the functionality. And this was a really large project that we did on Marshall's campus at the dorms that they constructed about 3 years ago. And I'm sorry, I'm moving through these really quickly. I do apologize, but nonetheless, this was another one of my favorite projects here on campus. And I wanted to share this one just because this was a project that it's not anything flashy or huge, but it does get the conversation started about where your stormwater goes when it falls on your property and how you can actually capture and use it. We ended up putting in a stormwater planter, and a stormwater planter is essentially just a rain garden in a box. And it was very simple, and we were interested with the idea if we could copy these and stick these around campus. Now, we weren't going to capture every single drop of water that fell on the property, but nonetheless, it started the conversation. The city loved to see this because they were having some issues with their MS4 and the regs and managing stormwater across town, but it was a really nice project. The hardest part about this project was getting the bricks to match up on a building that was closing in on 200 years old, but nonetheless, pretty successful project, still there to this day. And it's a conversation piece for when we do talk about stormwater and stormwater management. And let me see whatever else I've got. I've got some of the maintenance issues that you would have to deal with. And again, it's good to have those conversations with the group of folks that are going to be taking care of the project long term, because that really can make or break a project in the end. And I'm going to go ahead and stop right there because I know I'm getting close on time and I'm trying to be respectful of other folks' time.
Thank you. These projects were fantastic to see so many concrete examples of what this work can look like. Great to see the progress over time and the learning. So hopefully we have more time for that when we open it for questions. I'm gonna fly us from West Virginia to Kentucky. We're gonna hear from Rebecca Shelton, and we're gonna move from the urban options to think about where our water goes and permeability to some rural options about where our water is going and how to make things more absorbent when it rains.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Dana. I'm Rebecca Shelton. I'm the Director of Policy at Appalachian Citizens Law Center. We're based in Whitesburg, Kentucky, which is in Letcher County. Yeah, I'm going to talk about mined reforestation as a potential project for flood mitigation. So surface mining is one of the biggest drivers of land use change in the Appalachian region, and reclamation, the common reclamation practices often convert what was forested land into grassland or pasture. The soils on reclaimed mine sites are thinner, they're finer grained and highly compacted, so they have less water holding capacity. Ultimately the result is the surface of a land on a reclaimed mine site acts more similar to an urban kind of impervious surface than what was once there, which was the forested environment. And there's a body of research that looks at the impacts of mining and the intersection between mined landscapes and water runoff. It is, of course, highly variable depending on the type of mining. Sometimes the fills can actually have water retention capacity, the valley fills. So there's some variability, but there's pretty good understanding that these mined sites where they are reclaimed like this, they are not able to hold a lot of water. And there are some fairly recent studies following the devastating floods in Eastern Kentucky in 2022 that modeled different factors, the contribution of different factors to the severity of those floods. And in particular, there was a paper released earlier this year that was a modeling effort that looked at human practices, anthropogenic practices in the headwater areas above the North Fork River. And the North Fork River is the one that runs through Whitesburg, and there's actually a river gauge right beside our office there. And the modeling that paper did showed that mountaintop removal sites did result in higher total flood and floodwater discharge and operated as a primary contributor to the flood volumes in the upper and lower portions of that watershed. So there are a lot of research-based, evidence-informed links between the impacts of surface mining and Appalachian hydrology. Next slide, please. So, but there's also a lot of potential for reforestation of these sites as a disaster mitigation technique. There's potential because there's a lot of land that could be reforested. There's about 1 million hectares of land in Appalachia that's been surface mined and that has either been bond released or is still currently permitted that could be reforested. And 1 million hectares is, just for reference point, is bigger than the state of Delaware. So it's a lot of land. Reforestation of these sites it could provide regional level mitigation from flooding. Because reforestation allows for greater soil water infiltration and storage, reduces surface water runoff. And also, trees, once they grow and are flourishing, are also uptaking and intercepting precipitation, so slowing down runoff and also minimizing the amount of total runoff. And then also zooming out, reforestation is also a global level climate disaster mitigation strategy because of the carbon sequestration potential, both through the carbon sequestration the carbon that can be sequestered in the trees themselves, and also the soils on these sites are so devoid of carbon that there's a lot of storage potential there as well. There was a study site in Kentucky where they looked at carbon sequestration in the soils there 18 years out from planting. When they looked at the upper 10 centimeters of the soil, they found that it was sequestering 4 metric tons of carbon per hectare per year. Next slide, please. So there is an ongoing initiative, and there's been years, decades of research on how to reclaim these mine sites in a way that results in these outcomes. So like I sort of mentioned earlier, traditional reclamation kind of prioritizes compaction, quick establishment of vegetation, and it's not there isn't necessarily a return to forested landscapes. A lot of times there's not, because it's not in the post-mining land use plan. The forestry reclamation approach is is backed by years and years of research, folks who are trying to figure out how best to reforest sites that have been so heavily compacted and that have all of their soil removed. It's not a super easy job. But essentially they decompact the soil by sort of ripping through it, and are able to plant trees and have pretty good rates of establishment over time. They plant a mix of native hardwood species. And this it ultimately, creates an ecosystem that is a lot more similar to what was there prior to mining than these kind of grass and shrublands. So the forestry reclamation approach, if you could go to the next slide, please. It is utilized by, some mining companies, but it is also really promoted and implemented through the Appalachian Regional Reforestation Initiative. And the Appalachian Regional Reforestation Initiative, it's a cooperative effort between the Office of Surface Mining, Reclamation and Enforcement, state agencies, scientists, nonprofits, and ultimately landowners in the coal industry and those who have control over these lands. It was started in the early 2000s, and it's essentially a network of these entities, the federal, the state agencies, the scientists, the nonprofits, who have been pulling together a patchwork of private and public dollars to reforest these previously mined lands. So there is no pool of, federal program funding that supports these outcomes. It's not something that coal operators are required to do, but it is this kind of networked and outside effort and initiative. But it's been very successful. So we have some numbers that we got from folks who are running the ARI program, that this is really conservative. I'm presenting them here, but it's really conservative because not all of the tree plantings have both number of trees planted and number of hectares replanted data. It's a little bit of a patchwork. So you can take this with a grain of salt, but just a representation that there has been at minimum, at least, and well over 64,000 acres of land that's been planted, reforested, and that's more than 20 million trees. So there has been a big push to invest in these reforestation strategies, but like I said, there's still a whole lot of potential because there's still over a million hectares of land that could benefit from this use. So the other, as Jessica said as well, in addition to the flood mitigation potential of reforesting these sites, there's a lot of other positive co-benefits. Provides really, new habitat and other opportunities for recreation, economy when you reforest these sites, and water quality contributions, minimizing sediment runoff. There's a lot of benefits. So I will just go ahead and end it here with ARI and Mineland Reforestation.
Wonderful. And there was a lot of excitement in the chat while you were talking, Rebecca, and some shout outs to Chris at Green Forest Works, who is on vacation this week, but was invited to speak at the webinar. So I'm really glad folks named him. And there's a few questions in the chat that I'll leave to you, Rebecca, or I might touch on in a minute. So when we think about the landscape of Appalachia and where the water goes, we have these urban surfaces that Mark referenced. We have former mine sites, and then we have our streams. And so our next couple of speakers are going to be thinking about our streams and riparian buffers for them, to say it in a more formal way, starting with Katie Commender from Appalachia Sustainable Development. Thanks for joining us, Katie.
Thank you. Let me get my slides up here. Can you see those slides on the screen?
They're trying. They're running slow. There it is. Yep.
There they are. All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining. I'm Katie Commender. I'm the Director of Agroforestry with Appalachian Sustainable Development. And I'm going to share another nature-based hazard mitigation solution called riparian forest buffers and talk a little bit about how to make them multifunctional to meet multiple landowner objectives. So just a bit about ASD. We're a nonprofit organization turning 30 years old this year, founded in 1995, based in Bristol, Virginia, far southwest Virginia, working to grow a stronger Appalachia through agriculture. And that includes helping landowners implement agroforestry practices like riparian buffers. And so Savannah Institute, one of our partners in the Midwest, has put together this really amazing visual just to kind of get us all on the same page about what we mean by riparian buffer. Essentially, it's any permanent vegetation that would be, planted or is naturally occurring along a waterway. So that oftentimes is woody perennial species like trees and shrubs that might be along a stream, a lake, a creek, a river, a wetland, any sort of body of water on your property. And buffers serve a variety of different functions and have a number of different benefits. And I'll cover the environmental ones first. Just as we're talking about floods during this call, it's really important to note that riparian buffers have an opportunity to reduce and moderate the impacts of floods in our region. And they also really help store water and recharge our aquifers, which is incredibly important function as well. I think Mark had mentioned non-point source pollution. So when we're thinking about, maybe sediment or nutrient runoff from our agricultural lands, or maybe chemicals or different pollutions that might be running off from our roadways, buffers can help sort of help prevent those from getting into the stream. It also does a really amazing job of stabilizing the stream bank. Mark had showed a lot of really great photos of what a really eroded stream bank looks like. And so the roots of the trees and the shrubs can really help anchor that soil in the ground and help prevent that erosion. And then, of course, habitat. So lots of really amazing aquatic and terrestrial animal species that we have in our region, and buffers provide really critical habitat for those species. There's a lot of socioeconomic benefits too. So when we think about creating multifunctional buffers, maybe we're looking at, instead of just traditional river birch or sycamore species, maybe we're looking at incorporating some fruit and nut species that could help boost food access. They could also help diversify your crops and your income from a productive buffer versus it just being used for conservation benefits. Buffers provide really beautiful aesthetic value. And if you're lucky enough to catch a fish or not sleep on the job when you're trying to hunt, you might have some good recreational values as well. When we look at sort of what our productive landscapes oftentimes look like, you typically are seeing what is pictured on the right-hand side. You might have a very channelized river or creek that is relatively straight, doesn't have a whole lot of meandering curves to it. A lot of the trees and shrubs and cover have been removed from the banks. You might be mowing right up against the waterway, or might have a road or agricultural land very close to it. There's not a whole lot of wildlife habitat, and you might end up having to put what's called riprap, or a lot of rocks along the banks to help stabilize it and keep it in place. And I'm a skier, so I just like to use this analogy. You know, if I'm skiing and I have my skis facing straight down the mountain, I'm going to bomb down that mountain as fast as possible. So if we think about it in terms of flooding during a really, big heavy rain event, if we have a channelized river without those really good riparian areas, we're going to have very, very fast moving water. Whereas a more natural river where you have a really decent riparian area with woody cover, you have sort of more of these meandering curves. You know, if you're skiing or snowboarding down a mountain and you're sort of carving those edges and turning, you're going to slow yourself down. And that's what a good solid riparian buffer and a more natural river can help during a flood event. When we think about buffer design, there's a typical structure that's associated with it. And so from your waterway, sort of the first 15 feet back is what's called your zone 1. And that is really an unmanaged forest, but it really serves the purpose of helping to stabilize your stream bank. So you're going to be planting very fast growing, very flood tolerant species. You might be planting live stakes in this area to really quickly get production going to help stabilize that stream bank and provide some wildlife habitat. And then your next 60 feet is your zone 2. That's your managed forest. And the big role of this zone is to serve as a nutrient sink. So timber or maybe fruit or nut species might be planted in this area to help uptake some of those nutrients through the roots. And then finally, you have your zone 3, and that is sort of the last 20 feet before you get into your human use area, whether it's a road or your cropland. And that oftentimes is, let's see. Oops, my screen is frozen. There it is. That oftentimes is a very, very managed area. It could be a grass strip, maybe for controlled grazing or for hay production. You could also grow short rotation crops in there, like woody cut florals that you might coppice and sell to the floral market. And this zone is really designed to help diffuse that runoff and slow it down. When you're picking the width of your riparian buffer, it's really important to first figure out what are your primary objectives. So for the purpose of flood control, for example, you might be looking at a minimum of 20 meters or about 65 feet in width to really be effective at reducing and moderating floods. And then I mentioned, if we're looking at a productive or multifunctional buffer, there's a lot of really amazing fruit and nut trees and shrubs that could be planted in that zone too. So thinking about, your mulberries, your pawpaws, your elderberry, and maybe even some nut species like black walnut or hazelnut. In that zone 3, or sometimes as a live stake in zone 1, you could also be planting some woody cut florals that could be sold to the flower industry. So thinking about red and yellow twig dogwood and pussy willow and other species like that that can be coppiced on a rotation. There are definitely some challenges with riparian buffers. So the first one I like to point out is planting stock. So if you're purchasing maybe larger containerized tree or shrubs, then oftentimes you'll have higher survival, but the cost will also be higher. So you have to factor that in compared to maybe a bare root seedling. And also, if you're trying to grow in a productive buffer, maybe cultivated pawpaws or elderberries that have higher yield and better tasting fruit, those are going to cost a little bit more too. And you also have availability to consider. It may be harder to source some of those. You can also plant bare roots and then graft scion wood from cultivars onto those bare roots, but that requires specialized skill for grafting as well. Pest and disease is another really important factor to consider. So, I've seen buffers where you go through the really hard work of a site prep and planting the trees, and then, oops, the deer eat them, or your mower accidentally mows over them. So making sure you have proper tree protection in place. And then lastly is labor and equipment. So consider, how you want to do site prep and maybe the timing and the seasonality of pruning. Do you have the labor for that? Same thing with harvest, and maybe what equipment might you need for that? So thinking through those things from the get-go is really important as well. And then some links are going to be dropped in the chat, but just to mention that there is financial assistance available if this is something that you would be interested in implementing on your property. There's funding through a program that ASD is a part of called the Catalyzing Agroforestry Grant Program, as well as the USDA and your local soil and water conservation district office. And there's a ton of buffer resources out there. So, Virginia Tech has this really amazing how-to guide. ASD's worked with the National Agroforestry Center on some various working trees fact sheets on buffers. We've put together an economic tool called the Non-Timber Forest Product Calculator to help you identify the profitability of a productive buffer on your landscape. And then even the University of Missouri Center for Agroforestry has an entire training manual on all agroforestry practices, including buffers. So that's a really great deep dive. And there's some links in the chat for you for those as well. And I will wrap it up by just sharing my contact information here, and I'll be available for questions as well later on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katie. And we're gonna fly back. We may not have planned this route very sensibly geographically, but we're going to Ohio now. We have to hear from Ryan Gilliam at Rural Action about some of their watershed work there.
Thanks, Dana. And we can go ahead and just jump into that second intro slide once you get that pulled up. I'm going to go ahead and introduce myself because I'm a little bit newer to the scene. I grew up here in Athens, Ohio, where Rural Action is based. But I left in 2011 to go to college where I studied geology at Bryn Mawr College. I did an internship at the Open Space Institute, which took me to Manhattan. It's not where I thought environmental work would take me, but that was a great opportunity. I went to grad school out in Colorado at Colorado School of Mines, and I really focused on stormwater management and green infrastructure and the policy barriers to stormwater reuse out west. That was part of this Urban Water Infrastructure Research Center. And then last year, I got started at Rural Action on the watershed team as a conservation project specialist. I'm in particular right now working on an NRCS agreement, working on riparian buffer uptake through their cost sharing programs, but we have a few other things in the works related to my background and interests that I've listed here. I really like this graphic of the annual precipitation normals across the US. It's a big part of the Western water rights that I worked on out west. And a lot of the planning I did out there around scarce water supply and wildfire resilience, really, it all boils down to we need ecosystems that are functioning to have healthy water and for flood resilience. So in that context, we were looking at post-fire debris flows and really costly water supplies getting even harder to treat. But I'm thrilled to be back in Appalachian, Ohio to contribute this type of work to this region. I was heavily impacted by flooding growing up, so it's really always been the plan to get back here. So let's go to the next slide. I know we're short on time, so I'll be flying through this. If you're not familiar with Rural Action, we're a community development organization. We have a lot of different programs. The watershed team really focuses on that restoring our environment goal here, and adding on helping small communities do big things and cultivating our future leaders. We're always working to connect people and ideas to the support and funding they need to make good things happen. So our work centers around water quality and community development, and our lane as a 501c3 is really education and engagement. And then we also do a lot of monitoring, project implementation for acid mine drainage, and other non-point source pollutants. And then we do a lot of planning and reporting. So watershed planning, like the Ohio EPA non-point source implementation strategy, AKA the EPA 9-element watershed plan, that unlocks 319 funding for projects. So all of that technical work that goes behind making these projects happen. And by these projects, I mean mostly nature-based and like bioremediation, non-point source water quality projects. So on to the next slide. Our angle at Rural Action has historically been all about water quality and aquatic habitat. Our work really got started in Monday and Sunday Creek, which are mostly here in Athens County and Perry County. They're very heavily impacted by acid mine drainage. But as I alluded to with my work in Colorado, the water quality and flood hazard mitigation, they really have the same set of solutions. And those solutions, the most cost effective, are nature-based solutions, whether it's bioretention and urban green infrastructure in small little micro ecosystems that have a healthy soil column in that one spot, or if it's that larger landscape scale connectivity, or that really most important riparian forest buffer area. Okay, next slide, please. Just wanted to acknowledge all of our amazing partners who work with folks at the local, like county, state, regional, federal scale. The Muskingum Watershed Conservancy District is one particular partner. They work in a basin that's 20% of our state. So they're a great partner in funding NPSIS work and managing their land. But all of these folks deserve a shout out, and we just don't have time. So in addition to them, I do have to shout out the communities that we work with and all of the people and the local leaders and residents that engage with us. So now I'm going to run through really rapidly kind of 3 prongs of our project work. One is a lot of outreach and engagement around riparian restoration. So we have a few different projects that our deliverables are around engagement, site visits, and technical assistance that helps get people in the door for different types of funding to do riparian forest buffer plantings and other aquatic habitat projects, including wetland projects and whatnot. So we work not only with NRCS and their equip funding and other things, but we facilitate a number of H2 Ohio wetland projects and H2 Ohio river projects, and many more things I'm not listing. But a big part of this work is oriented around hellbender habitat in Ohio. We're working with the Ohio Hellbender Partnership, and riparian forest buffers are one of the most critical variables to their really prime habitat. So that's one of the cool kind of focus areas that we have in this work right now. On to the next slide. This is a site example of the Dillon Lake Wetland, which is an H2 Ohio wetland project. It's 90 acres with 14 acres of depressional wetlands that will provide more permanent aquatic habitat. And then the overall project provides, I don't have the number, but a certain amount of off-channel flood storage. And that's a partnership with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the Ohio Department of Natural Resources Division of Wildlife. So it will be part of a state wildlife area at the end of our project, which is how a number of our projects are going right now. Kind of we work through the landowner relationship, the project design, we manage the implementation, coordinate volunteers for tree plantings, and then we, for a couple of them, are transferring the land to Division of Wildlife to be public conserved lands. Okay, next slide. This one really ties into my background. I need to emphasize that this is a proposal. We don't have solid confirmation if it's going to be able to move forward, but this is a new type of project that our team is hoping to undertake as another way to move nature-based solutions forward. As I said, the water quality and flood really go hand in hand. So this project would provide planning information, risk education, and high-resolution geospatial information on inundation, sediment deposition and erosion, and how land use is really impacting those floods and erosion. In the water quality side of things, it will help us identify really high impact mitigation opportunities for sediment as a non-point source pollutant, as well as kind of building some of that leverage to get nature-based solutions happening on the ground. It's also going to provide some really critical emergency operations information for our emergency management agency in the county that we would like to do this with, including mapping flood routes that could be updated based on different levels of precipitation to inform local or regional emergency services and drivers. and many other things, such as someone mentioned in the chat, the idea of moving structures and development out of the floodplain, and a study like this that shows the potential for future kind of black swan event inundation could help build community buy-in for some of those proactive solutions that are really high cost, but maybe worth the trade-off for long-term risk management. So a model like this helps us put numbers and local specificity to the things that a lot of us know conceptually, that this is what helps and these are the good places to do it. We sometimes need that more detailed local data to get everyone on the same page. So my last slide is emphasizing the other programs at Rural Action, especially sustainable forestry and sustainable agriculture. We had a lot of focus on riparian areas and particularly in flooding. That's going to be some of the most dramatic mitigation, but all land is part of a watershed. So any land and soil quality and infiltration capacity improvement is flood hazard mitigation. And that again really comes back to the ecosystem. Is the soil ecosystem healthy? Is the forest structure healthy? All of those things add up to this general resilience. So sorry I went so fast and I think I still went over, but
You're fine.
thanks all, and my contact info will be available.
I can't wait to see it. I know folks are going to have a lot of questions for you and follow up. And I love the quote over at the end. So Emma from Appalachian Voices is going to wrap us up. If folks want to drop questions in the chat for our speakers, we're really excited to hear about the work y'all are doing. Emma.
Yes, hello everybody. So my name is Emma Kelly and I'm the New Economy Program Manager at Appalachian Voices out of our far Southwest Virginia office. So that's in Norton. I work out of Lee County, which if anybody knows their geography, it is the absolute corner of the state. And we are actually under a flood watch right now. So this is very topical. If you want to go to the next slide. So for some background for folks who are not familiar with Southwest Virginia, of course, flash flooding specifically has been an issue, but it gained some widespread attention beginning in 2021 around Buchanan County. And then of course in 2022, we saw the very large storm, which you can see in the graphic on the top right, that really hammered Eastern Kentucky, but because storms don't obey political boundaries, it was also in West Virginia and Southwest Virginia as well, largely over, again, Buchanan County and Dickinson counties. At this point in our work, we do expect significant flash floods in one of our communities at least once per year. Generally, it's much more than that, and sometimes they're smaller, but we expect kind of a wipeout event once a year. That's what we prep for now. Like Rebecca talked about, this flash flooding is exacerbated by extractive activity, both in terms of general climate change, and then when you log somewhere when you blow up the mountaintop for mountaintop removal, it really just decimates the land's ability to absorb water and then appropriately channel the water that's coming down. It's also exacerbated by our declining infrastructure, which is just aging and in poor condition and not able to withstand these repeated damages. Regionally, our most recent large round of floods was actually just in mid-February. So the photo on the bottom right is a brownfield building in Pennington Gap that I'll talk about a little bit more in a few minutes. As you can see, it is well underwater, and we do still have communities that are recovering from that round of floods. A few years ago, we realized that this was really a top priority for addressing in our region. And so Appalachian Voices developed their Community Strong initiative. And this was really the brainchild of Robert Kell. The centerpiece of this was focused on community designed resiliency. So I've specifically shouted out disaster and energy resilience, but I think we all recognize that community resilience is holistic. It includes economic resiliency, it includes food resiliency, social resiliency. We have to look at the whole picture. We chose 5 communities across 5 counties to really dive in deep on this work. So on the top left, you can see a map showing our geographic range for this initiative. And the central process for this was holding 3 listening sessions in each of these communities, so a total of 15. And throughout those engagement sessions, community members were able to define resiliency on their own terms, come up with their resiliency priorities, and then actually design the resiliency projects they wanted to see. What emerged out of this was this really beautiful natural synergy between flood mitigation, community building, and recreational development. Southwest Virginia is very focused on ecotourism. Of course, communities want to build up their social infrastructure, those common gathering spots. And so if you're going to build parks and green spaces, you might as well add in some flood mitigation as well. Next slide. So I am kind of speeding through this. Oh, back one.
Sorry, I'm having trouble moving it back. Let's see. Let me actually just stop the screen share and redo it. Apologies.
We always say technology is the best until it isn't.
Here we go. This should work.
It's trying, there we go. So we have several nature-based flood mitigation projects happening in our communities. I have pulled 3 that range from very big and very expensive on the left to small and pretty attainable on the right. The first is in the community of Pound, which is in Wise County. It has about 850 people, and the downtown area lies almost entirely in the floodplains. So as you can see the line that's sort of a U shape, that is the river, and the town is sandwiched in the middle. Back about 2 decades ago, the town wanted to do a river walk just for recreation, and because it is big and expensive and would take a long time, it never got off the ground. Through our Community Strong work, it has been resurrected. So this is actually an architectural rendering that was done within the past year. And the hope is that this would be about a 1.5-mile trail. Again, it would have a recreational component, right? There would be historical markers, fishing spots, all of that fun stuff. But it would also help shore up the riverbank, which is currently severely eroding, add in some native plant species, possibly some bioswales, replace some impervious surfaces with some permeable walking paths, and generally help combine the recreation and the flood mitigation aspect. Like I said, this is the biggest project we would be looking at. It would be a few $1 million. That is a lot for a community of 850 people, but we're really trying to get this done. The second medium-sized project is in Pennington Gap. So there's that building that was on the previous slides, the Kaz Walker building. It has been sitting dormant for at least 10 years at this point. It's been occupied and vacant off and on. It also sits along an eroding riverbank, and as you can see, it's got a lovely giant parking lot, another big impervious surface. The town recently got a study grant from the State Community Flood Preparedness Fund program, and they generated a project report, and this was the top priority, both from a contractor perspective and from a community perspective. So the plan here is to demolish that building, which we're currently putting an RFP out for, and then replacing it with another recreational green space. The town wants to have a playground there. We're going to build them some bioswales. Again, we're going to shore up the riverbank and stabilize that, help with a little bit of water quality as well. In the sort of bottom half of that image there, something I wanted to point to from a community engagement aspect was this ranking criteria. So you can see it says flood reduction, cost, community benefits, and maintenance. And this was our attempt to come up with an easy visualization for several projects so that folks could see what are the benefits, how beneficial is it, and then also how much will it cost for the town to implement and maintain. So you could really easily scale these and rank them. The third smallest project is in Dungannon, which is a community of under 300 people that sits in a really biodiverse section of the Clinch. They are currently working on an aquatic center for scientific research, and they wanted to add in a wetland boardwalk. So this would be a created wetland, but again, just adding basically a water retaining area with native plants to help prevent water from the Clinch going into their downtown area. This one is in very early planning phases. And I know we're short on time, so I'm going to quickly wrap it up there. I do have my contact information if anybody has any questions or wants to talk more about our other projects. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Emma. And I think we can, we can just stay in the big room, Liam. No need to spotlight at this point. We have had a very active chat during this event, which I told our speakers before we started that doesn't surprise me. I'm gonna go through a couple of the questions that I heard, and I'm summarizing some. We had a lot of questions about which I think Emma and Mark and others touched on really well about getting the communities involved, community barriers or community distrust of projects, which I think are such savvy questions, because when it comes down to it, the best projects in the world, people have to want them, right? Because they are expensive. So I wonder if any of our speakers want to talk a little bit about lessons you've learned or any examples of times that you've maybe seen community resistance to some of these types of projects, and how y'all work through it, or kind of what you learned about that process. So I don't know if Mark, I feel like you might have some examples like that. And then Emma, I know you referenced that with some of the tools you had. So if you have any of those tools to share, like the ranking tool, that might be something folks would be interested in seeing. So
hey, full disclosure here, I had to switch over to my phone because I've got an appointment this afternoon out Wayne, as we say. So I'm talking as I'm driving, but our situation, at least there on campus, we had, we were working with university officials who were fully on board, so we wouldn't have any resistance at all to the project. Actually, they welcomed us with open arms because we did have, funding in our back pocket, 319 funding that was going to help support a project. I have branched over. There's a local watershed association called Four Pole Creek Watershed. And, we are working with the city, which can be difficult sometimes. I don't want to talk too bad, but there's been a lot of flash flooding. Probably we've had 2 100-year events probably in the span of, 5 years, and several folks flooded out. And we have, it's very easy to strike up the conversation. We've attended, with my university hat on, we've attended public meetings, but I've also had my Four Pole Creek Watershed Association hat on as well. So those meetings we are very, very well received. And, the folks from the city talk about trying to strike while the iron's hot as far as getting something done. So our approach is usually water quality, but, there's a lot of overlap as far as the infrastructure is concerned when you start talking about water quality projects and water quantity. They're both going to have beneficial effects. So we haven't really met any resistance as of late, trying to at least have discussions about putting projects on the ground. We've got a watershed-based plan that kind of outlines a lot of the projects that we're going to implement over the entire watershed at a cost of probably around $4 or $5 million. So it's, we're really excited to get to move forward with that step. But I can understand sometimes there's reservations because in West Virginia, sometimes we're not as forward thinking as other parts of the country, let's just say. So there's always going to be some, reservations about trying to implement something that, something that's new and different. And, as we all know, green infrastructure, it's not exactly new. It is different, though, for a lot of us in West Virginia, where we're used to that gray type infrastructure.
I think that makes perfect sense. I mean, and the other thing that is always hard to articulate is how much money flood mitigation and prevention projects save in the long run. And I have a statistic on that I was trying to find. If anybody has a good one, please share it. But when you have communities that aren't counting every penny and cutting off services, it can be a difficult math. But because you are looking at short-term expenses for long-term savings, right? So any of our other speakers wanna talk to that dynamic and how you played it out? And I just want to thank Emma for dropping in the fantastic link to all those resources you have. Yeah, Katie.
Yeah, so I mean, oftentimes when we're working with private landowners on riparian buffers, it might be in an area where the floodplain is really the only like flat tillable area for, you know, maybe row crops or for hay production. And so a lot of times riparian buffers can be met with resistance because it's taking productive land out of, you know, they're losing that income, that farm income. And so that's sort of where to sort of build the bridge and try to meet farmers where they're at to provide both the economic benefit as well as the environmental benefit. We started working with multifunctional riparian buffers to put in those useful fruit, nut, and flower species that could be alternative crops for producers to be selling at market. And that seemed to work really well. We you know, back in, I guess this was about 10 years ago, we were partnering with U.S. Fish and Wildlife in the Clinch River watershed in Southwest Virginia, and we started out with one project, and then it was two, and then it was three, and then it sort of expanded, and you know, everyone was passing out my business card, you know, call the pawpaw girl, get yourself an orchard, you know, like it's became this thing that people wanted versus like, no, we don't want to talk to you. So I think it's what my advice would be is just trying to understand what are the landowner goals and objectives and try to design a system that meets all of those needs. It's not an and or, it's conservation and, you know, economic development as well at the same time.
Yeah.
If I could add to what Katie's talking about there, I know this was years ago when I was with the Conservation Agency, but yeah, just when you started talking about riparian buffers and, you know, needing that 35 or 45, sometimes 50 feet of width on a pasture that might be, you know, half that, or already just barely half that wide, it was always an issue to try to get it. But a lot of times it was like the carrot, you know, having a treat or something for them. I would approach it that, you know, with some of the $319, we could possibly go in and do repairs on bank. It might be failing stream bank, where, you know, you have really, you know, steep failing banks, you know, falling into the stream and stuff, and they have a lot of concerns there. And you would strike a deal that, yeah, we can do those repairs, but you're going to have to fence out, and you could work out if you could use a different pot of money, maybe like some state funds or something like that, and maybe just do some exclusion fence at the top of the bank just to keep livestock out, and then supply some water, because that's usually what the case was. It was always livestock in the middle of the stream. So just a thought.
No, that's fantastic. And I think, as you can see in the chat and with the speakers, you know, all of these issues are so connected to everything else. And so when we talk about the former strip mines, we start talking about housing, where folks are going to live, and it is, all of these issues are so interconnected. And so I think letting them be complicated and acknowledging those is just a fantastic way to make the work more real and more realistic for the folks who it's their land and they have to consider all those factors. One of the questions we had are tools to identify the best opportunities to use nature-based solutions. And one of the things I think I pulled from the Rural Action presentation is just a lack of flood erosion and modeling studies. Sorry if that was somebody else. You know, a lot of our communities don't have the data that, you know, a more urban, populated or wealthy area might have as far as, you know, what the risks are and what's needed. And that is a policy that we talk about in our Appalachia Flood Policy Platform, which we should share, Jessica. So, you know, for folks who are doing this, you know, do you have advice on, you know, figuring out where to start and what will work best, both as far as, well, you know, all the dynamics that are at play. how y'all approached it as you were getting started. And maybe the mapping and modeling is one that stuck out to me as like that a lot of communities just have to do for themselves.
Yeah, I'm hesitating to answer because there are these like climate risk mapping tools at the national level, and some states have developed them with state specific data. But when you're getting down to like site selection and like where is it going to be the best location, those national level models are maybe not reliable down at the site level. But if you do want to look at those, I think the best repository would be the US.gov. It's the Steps to Climate Resiliency Toolkit, and they have kind of a range of all the different online mappers and risk mappers and tools like that that are available, that are a place to start.
Rebecca, do you have some thoughts there? Yeah.
Yeah, I would just say like we've find somebody who's lived there for 20 years and they can tell you which spots where the water pools, what the problem was, like why they think it flooded. I mean, we've got folks in the community who have ideas about, well, they watch the water flow down out of the mountains and they think that if you change this area where the culvert was and open this up, then maybe the water would flow out. So I think like finding somebody who's observed how the water's flowing firsthand and has a problem with it is like your best, one of your best starting points for getting something going at the community level.
I have to chime back in because the proposal I talked about does include a community, like an Esri collector map, to have the local community provide that information. So have them show us, where does it flood? How high does the water get? Where's the problem culvert? And then we're planning to actually roll that into the HEC-RADS model calibration phase by verifying those flood points. So we're excited to like combine that local knowledge with the ability to project for future precipitation events that might have different behaviors and see how the landscape will respond.
Yeah, Emma.
Yeah, I was also going to pile on to what Rebecca said. The community sourced mapping it's time intensive and it takes a lot of work and outreach, but it's the best way to ground source those site selections. When we did the second round of our listening sessions, we literally just projected a map of the town onto a sticky note and had community members draw like near their houses, near their public areas where they knew the water was coming from. And in the case of Pennington Gap, we were able to then cross-reference that with the study I mentioned that was state funded, for a little bit of sort of upper level verification. But I would say always go to the communities first.
Great. Probably just great lessons overall. So in my mind, I was hearing you talking and thinking, okay, so you go to the communities, you learn what everybody already knows, and then you pay a bunch of money to get it put on paper so you can write a grant about it. Yeah. All right.
Yeah. We'll just like chime in too with the first person in the chat who said I think always keeping in mind both the local perspective and experience with the watershed scale and dynamics is important, because I do agree. I think there are definitely cases where if you were able to put in projects upstream, you'd fix a lot of the downstream issues. So in terms of efficient investments, like, yes, totally agree. And also think that is that kind of watershed. We've found that sort of watershed scale of planning and the kind of investment in that is generally lacking, and is just a big need for that kind of visioning and resilience planning. So
that's a fantastic point. And I think, we have programs that are broader, right? So it's more sustainable agriculture makes those fields absorb more water. And so that's going to have downstream impacts in this big way. So when you're thinking at projects, you can think in this really big global way, and then you can also get down to really specific locations. And so, overall increasing the amount of water that is going to be absorbed within the watershed is going to make everyone safer. I wanted to highlight this Washington Post article that is just kind of breaking down how, as what is actually happening in our atmosphere, that the clouds, to use a little bit of a kindergarten explanation, they just have more water in them. There's just more water coming, and it just doesn't have anywhere to go. And so anytime we can come up with a place to put that water is gonna make our community safer. And that's why we see all this flooding in places that never had it, because they never had that much rain in those short periods of time. As we're wrapping up towards the end of the hour, one of my favorite questions to ask is, what did you learn the hard way that you would like to save everyone the pain of learning the way you did? Like, do you all have any lessons from your work and process to share, you know, across the type of work that you do? Any tips for us? I know you all have stories.
I would just say with buffers, just the importance of making sure you budget tree protection. Like, don't try to skimp on that. I've seen so many projects where, like, oops, we mowed over the tree. Or like, oh, the deer got it. You know, it's just, I think it's a really important piece that cannot be overlooked.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I saw that in some of Mark's examples, and it was making me laugh actually, because the elementary school by my house has a water garden like that, and then during COVID the kids all started playing with it because there's nowhere else for them to play because they had to separate the kids, and now all the plants are dead. So just the world. Any other any other lessons for us? And then
Dana, maybe I'll share one more, that someone who doesn't work on implementing these projects at a local level, but hears about it a lot and thinks about how to integrate that into more policy. One thing we hear about is like just lack of the need for long-term monitoring of these kinds of projects, even if you're thinking about, like, if you do a restoration work and then checking to make sure it's not filled with invasive species or if no one's mowing over it. And like oftentimes when people are thinking about getting funding for these projects, or we're thinking about policies that incentivize them, we're not thinking about, like, what do you do after the project is built and how do you maintain it and monitor it and make sure it's still doing everything you need to. So just that's something to elevate, is thinking about like that. That's an important piece. Once we build these, how do we keep them doing what they should be doing?
that's so great. Just as we're wrapping up, I have one more question for the audience. I love Jamie Lynn's answer here. Too many to enumerate, too many lessons to enumerate. In this last slide, if y'all have ideas for the kinds of projects you'd like to see, as well as just future questions that you have for this webinar series, you can put those sorts of things in there as well, just to hear from those. And I do want to acknowledge all of the wisdom that is in the audience. I want to thank everyone in the audience who's been so active in the chat, sharing their knowledge. We probably have 50 people in this room who could have been panelists, so I really appreciate y'all's doing this work. So from David, over-reliance and importance of buffers as compared to floodplain reconnection. So yeah. So we're going to continue these conversations. There's always more than we can fit, even in an hour and a half. I think I'm gonna move us towards wrapping up. Thank you all of our speakers, both for the work that you do, as well as the generosity of sharing your time with us today. We'll close out for today. I can stick around for a few minutes if anybody has any big questions, and of course, feel free to share ideas in the poll as we're wrapping up. Thank you all so much. I'm just sticking around to see if anybody has any